course. Anyway, so thank you for the invitation. And so what I would like to talk a little bit today is a thing that we've done on studying what we call the shapes of cells and tissues, just as a motivation. So we'll start with that. And then I will try to convince you that many of the responsibility over these phenomena which exist are actually some what we call living active materials which drive all these phenomena. And we do these outside, of course, living systems, but we're capable to recreate many of the features that are thin there. So I will start with some brief introduction. Okay, so what we see here are some kind of excitement, yes. So I'm not a biologist. I never worked with any cell in my life. I don't even know how to do that. But still, what I brought you here are some examples of what individual cells are doing. So these are examples of, let's say, cancer cells or immune cells, which are trying to move around in our 3D world, in the 3D environment. This is what they do. These ones are more crawling, so moving on surface. And nevertheless, what you find here is a system that is, changing shape all the time, constantly moving, and it is extremely dynamic. And so this looks a little bit chaotic, but if you look on what is going on the bottom, these are still immune cells which are attaching to their antigens. And one of the things that they start to do is to change their shape. So here below this, let's say, dome-like structure, you have the nuclei, but on the periphery of this cell, you have some wrinkling, like petal of flowers that we saw. And this transition, so you see in the same cell, you can see different type of shapes. It's look non-dynamic, but it is. And actually if you take out, if you look inside and you look what is going on there, you realize that you have some mesh structure that is formed there, which is generated by what we call the cell cytoskeleton. So it is a mesh of proteins, filamentous proteins, that I'm going to talk a little bit more later, but they can have different type of organization. So this is not, I'm not sure it is really working. So I will show you here. So if you see here more important. So you see here some alignment into a ring-like structure, but here the structure looks completely different. And now what I will try to show you today is that what is really driving all these shape deformations are really this kind of mesh that reside below the membrane of cells and are responsible for that. So this is individual cells. And the typical shapes that you saw here are the wrinkled one on the periphery and in the center. But of course, this shaping is not associated necessarily to individual cells, but you can have cell doublets that interact and can undergo some remodeling. And if you look on the surface where they're interacting, this kind of interaction can drive, due to forces which are generated there, into different kind of instabilities. Again, saddle-like ones and dome-like ones, etc., etc. And if you go to the bottom part here, so what we see here is a tissue. So tissue for me, when we talk about leaves, so these are like plant tissues where you have many cells which are interacting. Here, this is a tissue of animal cells. And nevertheless, again, they can undergo some deformations which are elastic deformations, and this is why they undergo this kind of instabilities. And even a full organism like the hydra, which is something that Karen is working on in the Technion, undergo different deformation which can be very different on different length scale. And nevertheless, all the examples that I've shown you now are all driven by the same kind of material, which is the mesh, which is associated with what we call the cytoskeleton, this one, where what we see here is the cell itself. So just for the sake of people who do not know these things, this is the nuclei. This is a cell where you have the membrane, a lipid membrane, but below the membrane you see these gray regions where you have organization of a mesh of what we call filamentous proteins. Here it is the actin filaments, which are long, elongated structure, one-dimensional, which interact with different proteins. And the one that I'm going to focus on today is the one that exists below the membrane of cells, which is called the actin cortex. And what is special about this structure is the fact that it's very thin. So actually, it's like a piece of paper which is completely folded because cells are usually closed. But if you zoom on part of it, it is actually like a very thin elements that can undergo some folding. And the folding is generated not because you have forces which apply no onto this sheet of a network, but actually inside of it. So the question is how these deformations are generated, and can we study something in a more, let's say, quantitative manner without using any kind of cells, which is much more. So if I'm looking just in a very, very crude manner how these networks are looking like, so let's imagine you have a mesh and you have some elements here in the middle that can cross-link these long fibers. What is very special about these cross-links is the fact that they apply forces that can move them apart and even contract them, like muscles. So if you have, and this structure, I mean, this looks like that here. If you zoom in on one like that, this is the way it looks. So it has many, let's say, legs. They can interact with many of these filaments and generate this kind of structure, which is a cross-link network, which is actually active. And what I would like to convince you now with the examples that I'm going to show you is that the fact that you have filamentous structures that are remodeled by these active cross-linkers, which are called myosin motors, for the sake of people who are interested, which are exactly the same molecules which are responsible for the contraction of our muscles. So just that in our muscle everything is one-dimensional, whereas here everything is two-dimensional. The fact that it's in two dimensions, then you can start to see contraction in different directions, and mismatch in different directions of the contraction can generate this kind of instability. And this is what I would like to show you today. So I would like to understand how everything is working, whether this structure itself is capable to form different shapes, how it is done, what are the dynamics, and could we say something about the scalability of these systems? Okay, so the scalability, is it something that we can scale? Okay, so our experimental system, because we don't work with cell, we would like to really to make everything as simple as possible. So what we take is the elementary monomeric structure which are needed to form these filaments. We mix them with these proteins, which are these what we call active cross-linkers, which can generate this kind of relative motion between this filament. And what we do, we are capable to form networks, okay, as you can see, this looks like meshes, that first of all are going to form and then at a certain time that are going to contract. So if you look on this movie here, what you see is a drop of solution where you put only monomers in the presence of these small motors. It looks like that. If you look here, we can have a known dimension of these drops, known thickness, and we put everything all together in a mixture. We let the system to start to polymerize and cross-link and form the network. And the question is whether a simple drop of solution, which the only thing that we contract is the initial size, okay, diameter and thickness, we'll end up, first of all, and we'll end up in something which is deformed in the third dimension. This is first question. And second, what is the role of this initial geometry in defining the final structure? So this is the first question. And so this is what we try to understand. Now, a few things which are important. So as you can see here, while the network structure is forming and start contracting, if you zoom in, but one of the things that happens, and you need to remember, which is very important for the sake of the next slides, is the fact that during contraction, when something starts to contract, because everything is in water, you will have some flow of waters that gets out. And this is important, otherwise, I mean, if something is contracting, you need to expel some water. Now, the water movement will be really important to generate some, I would say, gradient in stresses that will start to form. Otherwise, as you may imagine, that if you take a disk and you don't have any gradients in any place, the only thing, if the disk contracts, it will end up in a smaller disk. But it will not fold in any kind of structure. In order to generate any kind of instability in the third dimension, gradients must be formed. And the question is how? We don't control here anything. The system self-shape itself. So how gradients are formed? This is a basic question, right? And what I would like just to say is that water release is important. Attachment of this active cross-indicator is important. They apply forces which affect other motors in the surroundings, so things are quite complex. I will show you today mainly the results, and if you have more questions later, I can ask, and I can respond. So just to say that when you want to model this kind of system, you have to take into account the flow of water, the active forces which are generated by these small elementary structures that crossing filaments, as well as you need to know that you have also, because you have an elastic material this is going to form, you have also elastic stresses which are generated. So you have a combination of three things that you need to take into account. So the main shapes that I'm going to focus on, just for the sake of simplicity, are dome shapes and wrinkled shapes. Okay, so these are the two-pixel, classical two-pixel dome shapes and more complicated wrinkled shapes. So they are defined by the number of nodes. Okay, they have an amplitude, a wavelength, etc., etc. So we know all these things. We heard about them quite a few times today. So what we found out is that wrinkled shape form, if you take a disk, again, a disk of solution, where you put only monomers, you let the system polymerize, cross-link, and start to contract, you start to see these kind of wrinkled shapes when the aspect ratio, okay, when you start with a large disk and relatively thin disk. Okay, so large disk and relative thin ones will end up in wrinkled shapes. And when they're wrinkled, again, everything is quite dynamic. I will just to show you, if you look at the periphery here, okay, they form, essentially these wrinkles are formed in the periphery. This is the structure of the jet during the contraction. What we see here is actually that first what is going on is that the disk is first shrinking vertically, okay, here, to form a thin sheet. And only then it contracts laterally, okay, but this is the way it ends up. Now, in the case of thicker disks, okay, or smaller ones, so a small or thick disk, initial disk, props, will end up in dome shapes. And one of the things that we realize in the case of dome shapes, that one of the very prominent features that happens here, sorry, I need to, that we'll see it again in a second. Okay, you see here a very strong alignment of filaments on the periphery. So one of the things that we find in the case of dome shape, that you have some ring-like structure that forms. Now, if you analyze the dynamics of this contraction, okay, you find out is the following. First of all, wrinkled shape. First, what we see here is how much, what we call strain, how much the thickness shrinks. This is in the what we call vertical direction. So this is the Z. This is the radial shrinking, and what you see that for the green one, which are the discs that will form or end up in wrinkled shape, they first contract vertically, so they get thin, and then they start to shrink laterally, but the wrinkling process occurs really, really at the very, very end of the construction. And we can assign this kind of change of the dimension of this disc in the following way. So instead of looking at the relative shrinking in each direction, you can look at what we call the aspect ratio, which is the ratio of the radius to the thickness. So initially, if you get thinner, so this is the thickness. If you get thinner, the aspect ratio increases, and then when the system starts to shrink laterally, the aspect ratio will decrease and reach a final value. Okay. And the wrinkling occurs typically here. For dome shape, what you find is the opposite. They start to contract laterally. You see, the radius gets shorter. Everything is in minus because they shrink. And only then they shrink vertically. Okay, so this is why they have an opposite behavior of the aspect ratio. Now, what we find if you look at this and you normalize everything, so you look how the aspect ratio changes relative to their initial aspect ratio, so then you normalize everything in a single curve, you find that wrinkling or disc-like shapes that generate wrinkles again shoot up and then decrease, where there are those that generate domes first decrease and then recoil a little bit. Nevertheless, what you find is that all shapes end up in exactly the same amount of aspect ratio, namely that they are all contracting about the same manner. And this is how things are looking like if you analyze the structure of these structures. So we can see as actually the fact that what really matters is not the actual dimension of the disk, but is the aspect ratio. Namely, this is if we plot everything, the initial aspect ratio to the final one, you see that all different shapes fall on a universal curve. Okay, well, these are domes. These are what we call interrelated shapes, and these are the wrinkled one. And they're all contract about the same manner. What you can see very nicely are these kind of typical structure, how they look like. So again, we increase, let's say, the size of the disc, the radius, the initial one. Let's say keeping the same thickness, the initial thickness of the disc. Just by increasing the size, you can really modulate between different final shapes. And again, the system is only sensible to its initial aspect ratio and its self-shape by building itself from scratch, and they all fall, again, in a very systematic manner. Now, what is quite amazing, I find, about this system is that the fact, first of all, that they are active. I mean, they are dynamic, the acting is programmed. And nevertheless, if you look on how, let's say, for instance, the wavelengths of this wrinkled shape scales with the thickness, you see very, very well-defined dependence, which goes like the square root of the thickness, very similar to what we call passive systems, which are not living ones. Moreover, what we realized also that the system is so much robust that the only thing that we need to know is the initial size of the disk, its initial thickness, and this will automatically dictate what kind of wrinkled shape will form, how many nodes we have, and everything is super robust. And again, we don't program anything. We start with a solution of monomers. So this is not only polymerize, contract, but generate gradients which are exactly the same for all kind of wrinkled shapes that are formed. So they really form a family. And one of the things that, and then I will finish with that, is to say, okay, so why one form or what type of a disk will form disks or dome-like structure and other will form a wrinkling structure? So actually, the main issue is the fact that what we realize what we realize, again, in order to generate wrinkled shape, what you need actually, if you take this, is that the center will shrink faster than the periphery. Okay, otherwise, and then you have an excess perimeter and it will ruin it. For dome shape is exactly the opposite. So how the system generates this kind of gradients, because I need gradients, right, to be done. So what we found out is that relatively thin disk, water is released very fast from top and bottom, rather from the radial direction. But when they start to get out from the radial direction, it is released much faster from the periphery. So the periphery gets very thick or very dense. It cannot contract too much, and you can see it here. So the density in the case of very thin disk, the density of the network is very, very low relatively to the one of the periphery. This is why originally you get a very dense rim, which when continue to contract, the only thing that will able to continue to contract is the center. So then you get wrinkling. In the case of dome-like structure, it is exactly the opposite. The fact that everything aligns on the periphery is such that if you calculate the stresses there, you realize that the periphery is less dense in terms of how much you can contract, like you see here. And the center is denser. Namely, the only thing that can really continue to contract is actually the periphery. Namely, if you have something that contracts more efficiently on the periphery, generated obstruction. So this is how we understand these things. Everything is, of course, connected to the activity of the motors and the release of water and the densification of the network. But this is the way we believe is happening. So this work is still in progress. Also thank you very much for listening, of course. So few words about the people who did the work. So this work started with a colleague of mine, Carsten Cruz, in Geneva University, and his student Daniel Pierce. We are now trying to work on the dynamics of these systems and try to analyze their behavior and all the strain profile, etc., in a more quantitative manner. So we do this with Kinja and Subaya. Geffen did the experiments, and this is the work that I've shown you today, and as such, he did some of the work that I did not show you yet, but thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions to Anne? So I'd like to ask, so basically you're saying it's a rate, it depends on the ratio between time scale of liquid going through the thickness and out of the margins.
Right.
And
Right.
this gives something which is locked, or the fact that something happens changes the material or the orientation, and
Right.
otherwise I would think so it will take longer, but in both cases it will become small and flat, but you say something.
No. Okay. So these active crosslinks are their activity is sensible to the local stresses which are generated. The more you have a elastic stress that develop in the system, the more they are attaching. Namely, if you have, let's say, and this is a positive feedback. Namely, so you generate, in fact, by applying forces of motors. Here you affect nearby ones. They will affect their how much they adhere. Then you increase the force which are generated, and it is a irreversible process. So, namely, you see. So this is why you generate this gradient, and they will never end up in flattening.
More questions?
Yeah, so you said that the water is expelled at a different rate between the
Yeah.
centers of the pure material.
Yeah.
What would happen if the rate would be the same in all the reactors, just drinking the same shape? Like a circle?
Yeah, exactly. This is exactly what we do. They can still deform, however, because the system is finite.
Okay.
The only way the system will remain isotropic is a sphere. All the rest, because you have a finite system size, because what I've said about this, what we call a strength stiffening process, the ring will be always, still have some gradients, either in activity or in density that we generated, so you will have some instabilities at this point, regardless of the fact that you can have the rate of contraction can be similar rates.
Okay, let's thank Anne. Thank you.
Hey. So we have a glorious ending of this great day. And we had scientists and designers and architects and people from the industry, and now we have an artist. And apart from the title of multidisciplinary